Good to be with you right here on the India Development Debate on ET Now. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and straight on to a topic that we'll be discussing tonight, and that is, are India's macros on the mend? The Indian economy seems to be turning a corner finally. Crude oil prices have fallen below $65 a barrel for the first time since December last year, much to the relief of the Modi government. The big fall in oil prices will boost the external finances, even as it helps stabilize the rupee. On the macro front, retail inflation fell to a 13-month low in October, virtually ruling out a hike in interest rates by the central bank after the Monetary Policy Committee meeting in December. Not just that, industrial production picked up steam in September, taking factory output growth in the first 6 months of the current fiscal to over 5%. Economists see a pickup in IIP in the coming months, backed by higher demand during the festive season. The sparks of a turnaround are surely good news for Team Modi, which has been facing a lot of flack over rising prices of food and fuel. The bright spots on the macro front and what it means for the NDA government ahead of the all-important general elections, and is this an inflection point for the Indian economy, is a big topic of discussion and debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and let's take this straight across to a panel of guests who are joining us right here. Sajid Chenoy, Chief Economist, JP Morgan for India; Mr. R. Gopalan, former Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs and India's former Finance Secretary; Arvind Virmani, President, Forum for Strategic Initiative and President, Chintan; Naina Lal Kidwai, Chairperson, Max Financial Services; and Maithili Bhusnoor Mata, Consulting Editor. Thank you very much, each one of you, for sparing time and being with us. And Sajid, if I may begin to ask you the question and the topic of this discussion, crude oil prices dropping to levels of 65, inflation being benign, are making some people, including Uday Kotak, say that the heavens are smiling on India. But is it too premature and perhaps too presumptuous to believe that this could be an inflection point?
You know, I think what we've seen over the last 6 months is a very challenging environment for emerging markets. It was almost like the perfect storm, where you've got the US Fed raising rates every quarter, oil prices jumped up from $65 to $85, and ever-growing concerns about a trade war. Now, the thing about perfect storms are, they're very high severity events, but they rarely last by construction. So I'm glad that policymakers basically held their nerve and kind of weathered the storm. I think a lot has changed in the macroeconomic environment over the last month for India. The biggest breathing space here is provided by the sharp fall in oil prices. Oil at 85 and oil at 65 is a very different dynamic for India. Secondly, the fact that food inflation has remained so benign has meant that inflation has undershot what people had expected, and that provides much more degrees of freedom for policy. So I think the environment today compared to a month ago is quite different. All of that said, we cannot afford to lower our guard or become complacent because of just the sheer volatility. Oil has moved down $20 over the last month. It's possible, things could move back up in the next few months. We know the trade war, one day gets better, one day gets worse. So there's a lot of policy uncertainty there. And we know for sure that just given the strength of the US labor market, the Fed will be raising rates through most of 2019. So we should thank policymakers for weathering the storm, for maintaining their nerve, take advantage of what's happened globally, but not become complacent.
Okay, Sajid, give me a minute. I'll go across to Naina Lal Kidwai and then go across to others in the panel. And ma'am, has the macro picture changed substantially after crude has tanked to 65? I mean, many people are saying this is big India advantage. How big an advantage this is? There are also others who say that this gives policymakers headroom to move ahead. What could some of the realistic options of moving ahead be?
Well, I think, Supriya, the good news is that at least we've got control in terms of these prices. And the good news again is that there are indications, I read somewhere, that we'll actually see an oil supply surplus in the world going into early next year. So it would suggest that these rates as they hold now may actually remain. But exactly as you heard said, the volatility is something we can't rule out, but it looks pretty positive right now. The headroom, I fear, is somewhat limited as we go into an election year, because if we look at the impact on growth, one, in any cases, the base effect itself, which doesn't help in terms of where we're at today. And then election uncertainty and spending restrictions which come as a result of the election. There isn't too much time left for government to go out and actually put money to work, which might have further helped growth. There is another factor which worries me a bit, and that is the inflation as it's seen right now. Clearly, food inflation has dropped enormously, which is great, and looks like it will continue to. But there are aspects of inflation, at least as I've read it, which are worrying in that health, some household goods, personal goods are actually up. And this could be because input prices have increased, and that has been passed on now to consumers. So is there a bit of an inflationary impact coming from non-food items is something that needs to be watched as well. So we can't get sanguine. We have to know that it is a very volatile time. And I do also worry about the shadow banking system, which has been well handled thus far for the moment, but I don't know if we weathered the storm completely. So there are still factors which could impact us and impact growth going forward and impact sentiment as well.
All right, so too early to call hooray and raise the, uncork the bubbly, so to say. There are still factors on the horizon that may not augur too well. And I'll go to those in just a bit, but let's get down to specifics. And Mr. Argopalan, if I may come to you, inflation at 3.3%. What sort of an impact will it have on both the fiscal and the monetary policy? Seemingly benign. Food has been under control, and the larger question is liquidity, and I'll come to that in just a bit. But let's first get inflation out of the way.
Well, inflation as of now, even RBI has said it is going to be between 3.9 to 4.5 in the second half, and therefore they are not expecting inflation to go beyond because of both base effect and other factors. But please remember, the core inflation and the core are still higher, upwards of 5.1 and 5.3. Now, that is something which I think the sellers are not able to pass on the increased prices of inputs, and therefore there is going to be a problem on a little bit of a problem on the earnings as far as these companies are concerned. But I am more worried about two other factors. One is the fiscal deficit. Now, today let us look at the collections. The indirect tax collections, according to my estimates, are going to fall short by about 60 to 75,000 crores. Earlier, government used to not pass on last year the IGST credit entirely to the state governments. Now, that half of it they used to retain. Now, if state governments feel that as of 31st March 2019, the entire IGST credit to the states have to be given. If that happens, I expect the shortfall to go up to 1 lakh crore. So, how is that going to be made out? And in addition, even assuming that today the price is 65, but if OPEC decides to reduce the volume by 1 million barrels a day, as they are planning to do, the price may go up to about 70 to 75. Now, with that, with the oil this thing budgeted at 24,000 crores, may go up to 42,000 crores. There is going to be a big problem as far as fiscal deficit is going to be concerned. Now, what will happen? We have to cut down expenditure. You cannot cut down revenue expenditure; it is very sticky. So, let us cut down the capital expenditure, which will have deleterious effects as we go along in future. So, my problem is the fiscal deficit, number one. Number two, inflation. Number two, the oil prices as we go along. Of course, the other problems of the credit going through various sectors, SME sectors, not yet getting picked up. Those are some of the issues which will reduce the focus on industrial growth. So, these are some issues, and incidentally the high frequency indicators are mixed. Okay, and I'll come to that later. But the
what
core
is also
industries.
mixed? Give me a minute. Yes, we will come to high frequency indicators and core industries in just a bit, but I think there is also a mixed picture that seems to be emerging. And Dr. Virmani, WPI number has gone up for October. I think it's at 5.1%, which is a 4-month high. Is the inflation picture then in that sense more mixed than benign?
See, the research has shown
that unlike in many other most developed countries, the food, this core inflation has to be looked at very carefully. We all know that the core inflation, at least as measured by some people, have gone up to 6.1%. But it turns out that research shows that even more than other emerging market economies, it's really the food and fuel inflation actually, after a lag, feeds into the core, and therefore this means that it works both ways, right? When it was going up, when we had the higher oil prices, etc., it would tend to push up the core inflation, and it will work in reverse. So I am a little less worried about the rise in core inflation than many other commentators. That is one. Secondly, as far as agricultural prices are concerned, which are an important factor, I think people, something which I have pointed out repeatedly over the last few years, that we had after 7 to 10 years a double drought, and that has been followed by 2 normal monsoons. And there are very important lessons from that. Actually, when we were in the middle of that double drought, we didn't have an explosion, which we've often had before, of food prices. And the 2 normal droughts have already resulted in a decline. So there are certain demand and supply changes which are there in the economy, which we need to take account of in future. And I don't think the agricultural economists have really, except perhaps for a few, have focused on the underlying changes which are happening. So the fact that just the second normal drought has reduced inflation, food inflation so dramatically, means that we need a kind of fundamental change in our agricultural policy. So as far as inflation is concerned, I would mention that. And just very briefly on the oil, again, to me the most important uncertainty there was the geopolitics of it, and therefore the uncertainty in some sense still remains, and that was the whole Iran sanctions. People generally think of sanctions as inability to get oil, but to me the bigger problem in the last 6 months was that oil prices were rising. Now that uncertainty has somewhat been cleared, they have fallen, but that is not over, because the next stage of the sanctions, I think, is March 1st or something. So to me that is actually more important uncertainty than the exact
Dr. Vermani,
inventories and the demand supply balance today.
Fair point. Okay, Dr. Vermani, hold that thought. Maitri, I'll come to you. We've spoken about inflation. We've spoken about whether the picture is looking really rosy, and it certainly doesn't seem to. There are many issues to wonder there. But let's touch upon the currency. The rupee may have fallen, but at least is stable right now. There is no volatility that one was seeing, at least the kind a month back. Is that good news on the macro front?
Well, Supriya, predicting where the rupee will be today or tomorrow is really a mug's game. So just because there's been temporary stability, I wouldn't set too much store by it, because the fact is that currency volatility is here to stay, precisely because external sector instability, volatility is also here to stay. So merely because the rupee has stopped depreciating and has started strengthening, I don't think we should do too much strength from it, because come December the Fed will hike interest rates, and then we might again see an outflow of dollars from the country, and the rupee might again weaken. So yes, to the extent that the rupee has stopped that steady downward trend and depreciation, I think yes, we've got a temporary respite. But as far as macros are concerned, I think we must always look at macros with a great deal of circumspection. It's because just about a month ago we were talking about how terrible our macros had suddenly become, and now merely because oil has fallen, suddenly they look much better. So I think we need to reserve our judgment. For now, yes, the macros seem to be improving, but will that continue? I would like to reserve my judgment on that.
Okay, hold that thought, because I don't know if Sajid has a contrary opinion on the rupee. And I agree with you, Maitli. We can't be looking at macros like we track equity every day. This is the technical point and the fundamental call and all of that. Macros need to be looked at with a far larger long-term prism. But Sajid, what's your view on the currency? Are we in a more stable zone today than we were, say, even 3 weeks back?
Well, first and foremost, I think you're exactly right. I think the nervousness that gripped the market has abated meaningfully. There were concerns about a self-fulfilling spiral a month ago. That has clearly settled down. But let's just step back. I think you have to look at the rupee's move in 2018 against the move in the previous 4 years. We've been saying this for a while, that the trade-weighted exchange rate appreciated 20% between 2014 and 2017. And I think in my view that hurt competitiveness. It kind of hurt export prospects a little bit. It made imports cheaper, and the underlying current account deficit without oil and gold widened by almost 3% of GDP, which is the reason the minute oil prices moved up, the headline current account deficit ballooned, and some people in the market got sticker shock. So against that backdrop, I think some degree of rupee depreciation this year was inevitable, was warranted, is desirable. We've had about a 9 to 10% trade weighted depreciation, which I think is the optimal response to what we've seen, the global shock from higher oil prices earlier in the year. And what that does, Supriya, is in a way, I think over time it will help competitiveness. It will help both exports and import competing sectors become more competitive. So I think the rupee depreciation is healthy, and the fact that the market is now settled down and there is no self-fulfilling fears of more weakness, will provide comfort to policymakers.
Let me just get a quick follow-up on that note, Sajid, from you before I move forward. CAD is likely to be at levels of 3%. At least those were the earlier projections, and unlike in the past, we don't have capital inflows, foreign portfolio investors making huge bets on India that will finance our current account deficit. We are staring at outflows largely, barring I think the 9 odd sessions. How big a concern is current account deficit, the external trade issue right now?
That's the variable that's moving and evolving very rapidly, and I think that's the variable that gets most impacted by this rapid move in oil prices, right? So let's for a moment hypothetically say that oil prices settle around 65. Of course, there's no guarantee, this could move back up. But if you assume oil prices settled at 65, even accounting for the fact that if the global environment, global growth slows, because these things happen together. One of the reasons oil has fallen is, yes, there have been some improvements in supply, but there are concerns about the global outlook. So in your balance of payments forecast, if you're penciling in lower oil prices, you must also take a less constructive view on exports. Even if you do that, and you assume that India's growth softens a little bit in the second half of the year, oil at 65 means that the current account deficit in the second half of the year could be as low as 2.2 or 2.3% of GDP. So the first half was closer to 2.7 or 2.8, but if oil is at 65 and growth slows a tad, the second half could be 2.2 or 2.3, and therefore things could be fundamentally different going forward, assuming oil is 65. And you're seeing that in the price action. Suddenly in the last 10 days, as oil has fallen, the rupee has been among the best performing currencies in the emerging market universe. So I think the future could well be quite different from the past, assuming oil is at 65.
No, fair point indeed, but I want to make a larger point out of current account deficit and really talk about exports. And Ms. Kidwai, if I may come to you, unlike in the past booms, exports right now continue to be weak, and the prospects of an export push also seem dim right now. The global economy is in a low growth trap. IMF has already scaled down global growth projections, and there are global trade wars on the horizon, and global trade has been consistently shrinking. Given that scenario, the fact that exports will not be sustainable and large in that sense, that is a big cog in the wheel that is missing from our growth trajectory, isn't it?
I think you're very right in that the big advantage of a rupee, which helps make products competitive, would be exactly export performance. And right now, it's not evident that we are in a position to benefit from it. There's been some benefit in the IT sector, but again, they have other headwinds coming their way. Pharma, so sectors like this, which have traditionally been very strong export oriented or have big businesses offshore. A little pickup in garments, but is this going to be sufficient to actually reap the benefit? Is very hard to tell at this stage. India's export performance has left much to be desired, but there are again, areas like defense, which we've seen some awards, and maybe with some degree of import substitution, we might get benefits into the CAD.
Fair point. Let me just take this across to Dr. Virmani, and I will come back to you, Mr. Gopalan, to talk about the fisc. Dr. Virmani, IMF warns of global growth becoming less balanced and rising downside risks, expected to grow at 3.7% in 2018 and 19. Rising trade tensions is one big factor. Reversal of capital flows for emerging markets is another. Tightening financial conditions by the US Fed continues to be yet another factor. Amidst all of this, I mean, I'm not just looking at this through the export prism, but how will all of these issues augur for India? Even though some macros are improving for us, and suddenly it seems that things are looking a little more favorable than they did a month back.
So let me start with the exports. You know, on your program only several months ago, I pointed out that the tariff war will actually benefit India if we are active in taking advantage of it. Now, the World Bank has actually, the IMF has now done the projections, and India is one of the few countries which they actually show that the tariff thing will have a positive effect on GDP, and it's a standard thing in trade theory. It's called trade diversion. So if China has difficulty exporting to India, some of those goods will be produced and exported from, in exporting to US, some of those will be diverted to India. Not all of them. How much of it depends on how we take advantage of it. And these are formal projections which have been done by IMF and are in their report. The only negative here is the general uncertainty which affects capital flows generally. So that feeds into the second part of your question, which is how the general uncertainty created by the tariff war and all the other things which we have already discussed, but adding to it the actions of the Fed would be added to that mix, is a bit problematic, because if generally there's an increase in risk aversion for capital flowing from the US and other developed countries, then that will have a negative effect on us also. Because again, the problem is that 90% of observers, not informed observers like Sajid here, but many others kind of lump us too readily with all the other emerging markets. So however, I think it is our job to make them aware that India is different and that they can still benefit from it, but I would put that as a risk factor, that the combination of the higher risk aversion arising from the tariff war with China, US-China, and this uncertainty about the Fed's actions over the next year or so, this could create general uncertainty which will have a negative effect.
That's an uncertain concern. Okay. Fair point. It's an uncertainty that's going to have a negative effect on us, but let's move on to the other uncertainty, and I think that is the fiscal position. And Mr. Gopalan, you were referring to this in your previous answer. Though there are a lot of people out there who believe that, you know, a benign crude oil regime could take care of some of the faults that may lie in the fisc. 3.3% for this financial year. You know, the big fear is, will there be expenditure cuts and all of that? The government so far has said no. It has even reduced its borrowing target for the second half. What's your own sense? Is fisc going to be a fault line?
Yeah, it is going to be a fault line. Once again, what do you think? You think 3.3 is 3.4 is okay or 3.5 is okay, but with the numbers I just trotted out, it may even go to 3.7. Now, that's not going to be really good. Even taking into account that the average oil price for the entire year is going to be around $70, if you take that into account. Now, one looks at fiscal deficit looking at about 3.6 or 3.7, mainly because of the GST shortfall in collections, and disinvestment targets I do not think it is going to be achieved. Now, what you should do, you will be in a position to compress the expenditure, which is a capital expenditure once again. Now, already the government, expenditure on the demand side is going down, and that is going to create, apart from the personal consumption expenditure going down, this also is going down, is going to create some amount of a demand stall in the economy, if you may call it. The other problem I face now is agricultural distress. Now, why the prices of agricultural commodities are low despite the fact that the MSPs have been generous, both in Kharif, not so much in Rabi, but in Kharif it was very high. Now, why the prices are in distress? Because we are not able to live up to MSP prices by procuring goods which agriculturists produce. Your insurance scheme, now you know that it is not, it has been going down, the Fasal Bima Yojana, the utilization by the farmers is going down. Now, all these things are going to end in a way where the farmers will not be in a position to get the right price, and agricultural incomes will go down as a result, and as a result of that the demand from agriculture side for the economy will also kind of go down. So, with these things which are in a sense will affect the demand, my worry is that it will also lead further into fisc. The collection, the fisc will also go down. So,
right.
I personally believe after making some
Fair
calculations
point.
that we are going to look at about 3.6 or 3.7 fiscal deficit this year, and once again that what impact that will have on people who are looking at India as a market for getting funds or investing into companies. Now one should look at how that pans out.
Right. So let me just get Sajid also on this point in time. And Sajid, while people believe that benign oil is always great news to correct the fisc, there is also going to be the revenue side implications, something that Mr. Gopalan referred to partially. GST revenue still to stabilize, likely to be lower than what had been anticipated. Growth in taxation not to the point where you could meet 3.3%. Increasingly, does 3.3 look challenging on the fiscal front?
Well, it may be challenging, but I have no doubt the government will meet it because I think the fiscal deficit, unlike the current account deficit, is a direct control variable. It's something that policymakers can in fact influence directly, and I do agree there could be some challenges on the revenue side, but I think in a global environment like this, I think policymakers fully appreciate the symbolic value and the signaling value of sticking to that number of 3.3%. The government has repeatedly reiterated it will, if it means some expenditure cuts later in the year, so be it. So I believe that we will stick to 3.3% of GDP.
Maitri, come in on this point about revenue versus fisc and all of that, and that really brings us to the big debate that's raging right now between the government on one hand and the RBI on the other. Is that where reserves are being eyed for?
Well, we have government officials denying that they were really eyeing the RBI's reserves, and what they have said is we're really looking in terms of a framework to decide how much of RBI's profit should be transferred henceforth to the government. So we really do not know what is the factual position on that. We have one version from the Reserve Bank of India and we have quite a different version from the government. But as far as the fiscal numbers are concerned, I do think the government will stick to that 3.3% only because they made it a prestige issue of it. They've gone on saying repeatedly that we will stick to that 3.3%. And remember, Supriya, there are any number of fiscal fudges that you can adopt in order to achieve that number. As far as the disinvestment target is concerned, yes, it does look very ambitious. It does look as if we're going to fall short, but you can always have one PSU buying into another PSU, etc. So it's not really so impossible to do it. You can always keep bills pending, Food Corporation of India, oil subsidies. So the n number of fiscal fudges that governments in the past have adopted, and this government too could adopt, though in the recent past with this particular government they have not resorted to it very much in the past, but that is always a possibility. So I do think they will achieve that 3.3%. And remember, oil falling from 85 to 65 is a huge bonus as far as the government is concerned. And even though GST collections may not look very good, direct tax collections are going to look much more healthy. So I think all in all we will achieve that 3.3%. And just one more point as far as inflation is concerned, 3.3 might look very good, but remember we've seen a contraction in food prices, and that signals rural distress apart from demand compression. So a very low inflation could also suggest that actually there is some falling demand. Demand is not picking up, and that again is not a very good sign. So overall I would think the macro numbers are still a very mixed bag.
Right. Okay, macro numbers will be a mixed bag, but Ms. Kidwai, in an election year, close to state assembly elections, I think the expectation will be that low oil should mean some amount of, sentiments being revved up, some consumer demand to be stoked, passing on some benefits of low oil prices to the consumer. Do you think that's doable right now, or will fiscal situation be a constraint? Is it even advisable for the government to do so right now?
So I'm sure, yeah. Any government going into an election year would love to put sops the way of the electorate, right? So I'm sure that's a desire. But I would agree with Sajid and others that the government, I think, also fully understands that India has to stand by a fisc of 3.3 because we've, in fact, stated that. And last year, when we bought ourselves a little leeway, it is a commitment, and it has quite serious implications if we are seen as actually allowing that slippage by so actively playing a populist game. So I'd be disappointed if that indeed happened. What of course should have been happening is when we had low prices, a reserve built up to do exactly the kind of weathering which we needed over the last few months, and to some extent it could have helped the government now going forward, because one of the purposes of assess is also to help even out this volatility when we moved into market driven prices. So I don't think that that reserve or window is there. So I think to whatever extent government can without impairing the fisc, of course it will pass on the benefit, but we possibly have to continue to look at higher prices than we might otherwise have had.
The revenue streams that we must focus and talk about is divestment. 80,000 crore worth of target, we've got nowhere close to that. And Mr. Gopalan, you've got experience with this. Are we going to go anywhere close to 80,000 crore rupees this fiscal? Because that's going to be a big revenue stream, and it will be difficult to crowd in a lot of money if you're going to push all your divestments to the last fiscal. I mean, and I'm presuming, REC and PFC and all of that doesn't augur for big ticket divestment, does it?
Well, I expect some shortfall. 80,000 is a big target. As Maithili pointed out, buying one company with the other and giving money to the government, that's a stratagem which was used in the recent past, and that will be done once again. For instance, NTPC may take up the hydropower companies, and those kind of things may happen. But the point remains that there is another thing which ETF is now giving some good revenue to the disinvestment department. Coal was not a very great success. Looking into the conditions, I think the opportunities available for the disinvestment department is not that great. So I still expect against 80,000 target, I expect a shortfall of 10 to 15,000. But once again, it depends on how the market behaves as we go along, and how the government is able to find time to get into these issues, sit down and work out, and then go into the market for the purpose of selling. But I still expect some shortfall of 10,000 to 15,000 crores. That's my assessment as of this year.
Right. Okay, we can't talk about the macros on the mend or the Indian economy without speaking about private sector investment, and that has been a big sore point. Ms. Kidwai, okay, I'm going to come to you in just a bit, Dr. Vermani, but Ms. Kidwai, the last available figure for gross capital formation by private sector was under 30%. I think it was even under 29%, which has come down sharply over the past 3 years. We did see some early pickup in capacity utilization. The question that I think a lot of people will ask is, by when will we see private investment break ground, because capacity utilization is a precursor to that? And I think the second obvious question that a lot of people will worry and ask is, what sort of a hurdle will the stretched balance sheets of banks and high NPA levels be in private investment breaking ground?
So Supriya, we've all been really waiting to see when demand comes back, and the good news was it was beginning to come through. So to some extent, capacity utilizations as they began to go up would suggest that companies begin to look at capital investment. But it's a very, even if you look at the IIP numbers, it's moderately good and improving, but it's still not vibrant. Have we actually seen capacity utilizations get up to the levels where large investments are planned? Not really. And then, exactly as you point out, if you juxtapose issues regarding banks' risk-taking ability, because even where liquidity exists, the bank has to be in a position to want to lend. So a lot of the capital-intensive industries have really had a very stormy past, and there are whole sectors for which the appetite to lend is limited. So I don't see that in terms of capital formation coming back. What we are seeing much more of is movement within sectors and the sorting out of NCLT type companies going into the hands of those who can do something with that sector. But that is not going to lead to capital formation. It's just going to mean that capital which has been sitting like a dead duck on the side is going to get whipped into action. So we may actually begin to see some of that output coming from stuff which was maybe not delivering because it was short of money and promoters were in a bind. So when you begin to see all that coming into the system as well, I think capital formation is still a big stretch away. Having said that, it's been a reasonable quarter, as you've seen through some of the companies like Larsen and Toubro in terms of orders and some of the infrastructure spend that particularly government embarked on. And I don't think we should miss that as a positive. My fear is that that will begin to fall off as the election begins to take hold.
Oh yeah, I will discuss the political uncertainty in just a minute from now. But Sajid, let me also get you on fresh investment breaking ground, and that has been very anemic. Even capacity utilization is extremely small, but it's at least pointing in the right direction. But I agree with Ms. Kidwai that a lot of what is happening is not really real investment breaking ground, but the more the P kind of deals, the brown field sort of stuff that's happening. What is going to aid private investment, and will NPAs be the big deterrent?
So we've seen some investment in the last few quarters, but I agree with you. A lot of this has been led by the public sector, by the central government, by the state governments, by quasi-sovereign entities. The key is going to be when, as you said, when the private sector investment cycle turns. I think that's still going to take a few quarters because, as you rightly alluded to, it's very unlikely one gets a big pickup in the private sector investment cycle when the economy and the banking system in particular is undergoing a deleveraging process. So I think we need to be patient here. I think policymakers are on the right track. We need to expedite the deleveraging as much as we can. Go through the asset resolution, recapitalize public sector banks, clean up balance sheets both for banks and the corporate sector. It's only when those balance sheets are cleaned up do I think will we get the impetus for more private investment. So it's good that utilization levels are going up because that means the private sector will be more inclined to invest. But I think the supply constraint is still binding. So the faster we can undertake the asset resolution of the banking system, I think the sooner we'll be positioned to start a private investment cycle. That could still take a few quarters though.
Okay, I think amidst this entire debate, it's very easy for all of us to defocus from the politics around this. And I'm going to come to Dr. Virmani and Maithili on both of these points. And Maithili, the macro reading, like you always said, cannot be done in isolation. There is a political overhang, first of state assembly elections, then the general elections that come up later. Is it time to look at macros with far more caution than we would have, say, 6 months back?
Oh, absolutely, Supriya. There's a huge political overhang, particularly in a democracy, and one where I think the macro picture is much more mixed now than it was before, maybe even a year ago. So today, with that kind of macroeconomic uncertainty, particularly global headwinds, I think the political overhang becomes much more important. Let's see what the election results for the assembly elections this at the end of this year throw up. But even if regardless of what kind of results we get, because in India it's very difficult to predict what the general elections will give us, the kind of results that we get based on the state government elections. So I think until the general elections are over, we'll have to look at all macroeconomic data with a great deal of uncertainty, caution, and with a great deal of circumspection. Given that we're going to get new macro data for the second quarter at the end of this month, I think a lot will depend on what kind of data we get, because the government will take its policy action based on what those numbers throw up. If the numbers look alarming, if it looks as if growth is not picking up, I do expect that the government might do something which perhaps will be a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction. I hope they don't do that, but definitely until the elections are over, there will be a great deal of uncertainty, and all macroeconomic data will have to be looked at with much greater caution.
Dr. Varmani, you agree with Maithili that up until elections, everything has to be looked at through the prism of politics? Or do you believe macros can stay independent of politics? I mean, crude oil prices are not going to be a function of who wins or loses state assembly elections in India or what happens to general elections. I could say the same about exports and global growth and all of that. Or are you somebody who insists that policy making is perhaps going to be subservient to politics from here on, and that's the big risk that we run?
Actually, I want to make a point where I differ with couple of your earlier speakers, which is on consumption. If you look at the consumption, it was on a recovery path till about 9 months ago, and as the oil prices went up, it stalled. Now with the reversal of oil prices, it's going to rise, and the reason is very clear. And again, I have pointed this out on your show before. The oil price in India acts as a tax on the whole country, and it affects, and the pass-through is there. The pass-through was there when it went up, the pass-through will be there when it went down, and therefore the taxation of the consumer in general will actually go down, and you will see that in the recovery in consumption. So that's my first point. I don't agree that consumption is on a downward path and it won't recover. You will see it recovering if the oil prices stay reasonable, let's say below 75 a barrel. On the other point, I think I agree with the point made about the banking, particularly the NBFCs. My expectation last year was that, as my forecast, that if the NPAs stall or reduce the level of loans from the banking sector, NBFC would pick up the slack. Now they have, but we have this unfortunate problem of the ILFC and so on. But my expectation is, though I agree broadly with the problem of investment recovery, I think the FII inflows, again conditional on oil remaining below 75, the FII and other inflows are going to pick up, and they will pick up the slack if there is a real demand for investment. Now clearly there will be no speculative investment, and that's the part I agree with. There's not just going to be financing, but I feel that if there is a real visible improvement in those sectors of the capacity utilization, then a combination of retained earnings and FII inflows will be available for investment. But that's not to say that it's going to be a very quick and speedy recovery. Now as far as the politics is concerned, again I go by research. The research shows that whatever the political outcome, generally it recovers. But again, this is the game of investment, is about uncertainty. So clearly if there are things where specific projects which could be affected by a change, there would be a delay in investment recovery.
Fair point indeed. Quick last questions to Ms. Kidwai, Mr. Gopalan and Sajid. And Mr. Gopalan, if I may come to you, India growth is going to be fueled by private sector investment and spending and strong global economy. Both of these are, still on very uncertain ground, so to say. Which one do you believe could be our bigger threat?
To me, the bigger threat, as we see, I mean, if you look at the our industrial scene now, capacity utilization has touched 75 and it is growing. Now, the public sector investment is also showing improvement, and therefore, if the right atmosphere, price containment and high oil prices are not there, and your NBFC problems and credit to MSMEs are taken care of through some mechanism, I see that picking up once the political uncertainty about who is going to come to power is over. That would in some sense pick up. My bigger threat as I look at it is the international emerging issues. For instance, the dollar strength gaining, if one would look at the US Treasury is going to pick up something about $1.33 trillion next year to make up the shortfall for revenues which is coming up, and also on account of the tax giveaways they have given. Now, that certainly will have an effect on the the interest rates there, and therefore, the dollar will certainly gain strength. So, what will that happen? What will that mean for Indian economy is something which we have to look up as we go along. And uncertainties in the European growth rate, Brexit obviously has been solved at this point in time.
Right.
We need to see the details. China slowing down because of the tariff war. Of course,
right.
money gives some IMF numbers, but once again with the confidence levels going
right.
down, those numbers will also take a dive. So, this thing is external environment in my view is going to be a bigger factor to look into on the growth strategy as far as India is concerned.
No, fair point indeed. Just hold that thought, because I'll give a quick last word to Ms. Kidwai before we wrap this. And Ms. Kidwai, what would that one big block have to be in place for us to achieve sustainable growth and for at least us to leverage some macros that are turning favorable?
Well, clearly demand continuing to go up, because that is what will bring private investment bank, albeit maybe not in the next quarter, but further down the line. So for demand to continue and for there to be some stability in the global environment, because a rupee that moves up and down with movements in crude and otherwise does not help any investment scenario, whether it's in the capital markets or in terms of long-term investment. It just spooks investors generally. So a stable rupee at or around these levels would clearly be very helpful.
All right, a stable rupee around these levels will be helpful, and even if there is a fall, it has to be gradual and not volatile. But on that note, completely out of time here on this edition of the India Development Debate. Can't thank this wonderful panel enough. Maithili Busturmat, Ms. Nainal Kidwai, Sajid Chinoy, Dr. Arvind Virmani, of course, Mr. Argopanan. Thank you very, very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate. As we put the spotlight back on the macros, there are some macros that are on the mend, but is it perhaps too premature and perhaps also a little provocative to believe this could be the inflection point is the big question. There will be a political overhang from here on. We've got to watch out for how we tread the path as far as lower regime is concerned. Any amount of fiscal adventurism is not going to augur well for an economy that hopes to grow at a sustainable and a responsible pace. Thank you very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate. Take a quick breather, back with Top 10 at 10.